A woman who walks alone, untethered from the romantic attachment society so often prescribes, embarks upon a profound journey of individuation. It is not a path easily explained in the language of surface living, for it moves through the unseen chambers of the psyche, where one meets not the world as it appears, but the self as it truly is. Such a journey cannot begin when one is caught in the mirrored reflections of others' desires, projections. It begins in solitude, a sacred space where the masks fall away and the quiet voice within, long overshadowed by external noise, begins to speak. This is not the isolation of despair or bitterness, but rather the conscious separation required for transformation. There are moments in every life when the individual must step away from the collective current and ask, who am I apart from my roles, my relationships, my obligations? Who remains when no one is watching, when no one is watching? When no one is affirming or denying my worth? The woman who walks alone enters into this vital inquiry, not because she is unworthy of companionship, but because she seeks something deeper than transient approval. She seeks the authentic self, not the self shaped by convention, but the one born of inner truth. In this space, the boundaries between what has been imposed and what is inherently hers begin to blur and dissolve. She begins to notice how much of her previous identity was built upon the unconscious need to be seen a certain way by others, as desirable, as acceptable, as successful by collective standards. Without a partner to reflect these societal ideals back to her, she confronts the emptiness of external validation and steps into the rawness of her own becoming that calls. This is the first initiation into the journey of the soul. Solitude strips away distractions, revealing the depths of one's uncharted interior. Old wounds rise to the surface, forgotten dreams stir. The mind rebels against silence, for it fears the truth buried beneath its ceaseless chatter. Yet in persevering through these initial storms of the psyche, she begins to sense something ancient and unyielding within herself, a quiet authority that has always been present but often ignored. The woman walking alone encounters aspects of herself that were once suppressed or disowned in the pursuit of relational acceptance. The parts of her personality deemed too wild, too ambitious, too fragile, or too strange are no longer negotiable in the absence of an external other. They resurface as essential facets of her wholeness, waiting to be claimed, honored, and integrated. It is here that the authentic self begins to coalesce, not as a fixed identity, but as a living, evolving truth that rises from the depths of the unconscious. Without a romantic partner defining her role or shaping the narrative of her worth, she comes to know herself in a way that no mirror could ever reflect. The journey of individuation is not the rejection of connection, but the preparation for deeper, truer relationships. Ones not built upon dependency or projection, but upon mutual recognition of wholeness. Yet this cannot be rushed. It requires a period of sacred solitude, where the woman learns to sit with her own discomfort, to listen to the language of her dreams, to follow the symbols that emerge from the silent places within. She may find herself drawn to unfamiliar pursuits, ancient myths, or sudden creative urges. These are not random, but signs of the psyche reorienting itself towards its natural state of harmony. The woman who walks alone learns to trust these inner signals, knowing they are the breadcrumbs that lead her through the dark forest of unconscious patterns into the clearing of self-realization. This journey is rarely celebrated by the outer world. Often it is misunderstood, even pitied. Yet those who have traversed its depths recognize it for what it is, a rite of passage older than language, encoded into the very fabric of human experience. And though it may appear that she walks alone, she is accompanied by the wisdom of countless others who have made the same descent into themselves, emerging not as someone new, but as someone finally entirely themselves. When a woman walks alone, choosing to exist outside the bounds of romantic attachment, she steps into a rare and powerful space, the freedom from external projections. Human relationships are, by their very nature, mirrors. They reflect not only who we are, but more often who others wish us to be, or who they unconsciously fear and desire within themselves. In romantic partnerships especially, projections are potent forces, shaping perception, blurring truth, and weaving illusions where genuine understanding might otherwise exist. To move without a boyfriend is in many ways to step out of this tangled web and begin the delicate, necessary work of encountering oneself without distortion. In every relationship, we cast unconscious images upon the other person. We see them not as they are, but as representations of our inner world, our unmet needs, unresolved fears, and idealized fantasies. Likewise, we become the canvas upon which others project their own invisible narratives. The woman in a romantic relationship often finds herself adorned with layers of meaning that have little to do with her true nature. She may be cast as the nurturer, the muse, the savior, or the submissive partner, depending on the unconscious needs of her companion. These roles are seldom spoken, yet they quietly dictate behavior, expectations, and the emotional currents of the relationship. To be without a boyfriend, then, is to no longer serve as a vessel for another's unexamined desires or unresolved wounds. The absence of romantic projection offers an invaluable clarity. Without being constantly seen through the lens of another's unconscious, a woman has the space to observe herself more honestly. She can begin to discern which parts of her identity were adopted to please, to attract, to comfort, or to sustain a bond. In solitude, these borrowed selves start to fall away, and what remains is an encounter with her unembellished, unreflected being. This is not a journey without discomfort. Projections, though confining, can feel reassuring. They give structure and direction, even when they do not align with one's authentic nature. The removal of these projections can feel like standing naked before the vast, unknowable expanse of the inner world. Yet it is only in this state of psychic undress that the true work of self-integration can begin. Freed from the images others have placed upon her, the woman is invited to face the aspects of herself she has long neglected or hidden. Moreover, in this freedom, she gains the ability to confront her own projections. Just as others unconsciously cast their inner world onto her, so too has she, in past connections, placed ideals and fears onto her partners. The solitary path reveals the ways in which she has sought to externalize the unresolved dimensions of her psyche. She may notice how she once searched for security, approval, or validation through another's presence, mistaking it for love. In stepping away from these dynamics, she retrieves those disowned fragments, gradually weaving them back into the tapestry of her own wholeness. This absence of romantic projection also transforms how she perceives the world around her. No longer consumed with being seen a certain way, she becomes more attuned to the subtle nuances of human behavior. She observes how often people's interactions are shaped not by conscious intention, but by unseen inner forces. She begins to witness the universal nature of projection, how each person in their way navigates a world largely composed of their own reflections. In this recognition, there arises a kind of quiet compassion, both for herself and for others, understanding at last that much of what passes between people is a dialogue of shadows. The woman who walks alone, unburdened by the weight of another's image of her, begins to sense the stirrings of her own inner authority. She is no longer beholden to the affirmations or criticisms of a partner who may or may not see her essence. Instead, she learns to hold her sense of worth, beauty, and meaning from within. The judgments of others lose their power, for she no longer requires their projections to define her. In this liberation, there is immense strength. She moves through the world not as an object within someone else's story, but as the author of her own, guided by the wisdom that arises from seeing clearly without the distorting veil of borrowed image. When a woman walks alone, she inevitably encounters the most elusive and often unsettling parts of her being, what some would call the shadow. In the quiet absence of romantic entanglement, there is no longer the comforting distraction of another's presence to mute the inner voices that have long been buried beneath the surface. What rises in solitude are the feelings, impulses, and memories she may have carefully avoided when accompanied, the facets of herself she was too afraid, ashamed, or uncertain to fully acknowledge. Without realizing it, relationships often serve as mirrors in which these hidden elements are either denied or displaced onto others. But alone, there are no such mirrors. There is only the woman and what lives within her. The shadow is not necessarily evil or dangerous, though it can be unsettling. It is composed of all that the conscious mind rejects or refuses to integrate. This includes not only socially undesirable traits like jealousy, anger, and fear, but also suppressed strengths, desires, and longings for which there was never permission or space. The woman who walks alone begins to notice the subtle stirrings of these neglected parts. Perhaps she feels an unexpected rage at something insignificant, or an unexplainable sadness that wells up in the night. She may recall moments from years past, a betrayal, a humiliation, a hunger for freedom that return unbidden, asking to be felt at last. It is in these moments of solitude that the psyche creates the conditions for healing and transformation. To encounter one's shadow is not to be overcome by it, but to recognize it as an inseparable part of the whole self. The woman learns that her fears and insecurities are not signs of weakness, but invitations to deepen her relationship with herself. The loneliness she sometimes feels is not a curse, but a space where these hidden aspects can rise to the surface without judgment or interruption. She starts to understand that much of what she has labeled as undesirable or unworthy within herself was not born of inherent flaw, but of inherited ideas about what a woman should be, should feel, and should desire. In confronting her shadow, she may notice how many of her past behaviors and choices were attempts to avoid this very confrontation. Relationships might have provided temporary refuge from the discomfort of her own depths. The need to be loved, to be chosen, to belong often served as a shield against the inner work waiting for her in solitude. But now, without a partner to distract or affirm her, the illusions dissolve. She sees herself in her rawness. Proud, afraid, ambitious, tender, resentful, and endlessly complex. This encounter is not a single moment, but an ongoing, often cyclical process. Certain nights or days bring sudden clarity, while others return her to familiar patterns of avoidance. Yet, over time, the woman becomes more skilled at sitting with these inner guests, learning to name them, to question their origins, and to reclaim the energy she once spent suppressing them. Za ondúfit pe paste passion, tada v pejudish, she ondúse resists her anger, her grief, her longing for absolute freedom, are not her enemies but her teachers. They reveal the places where she was wounded, where she compromised her truth, where she accepted less than she needed. Through this slow, courageous work, she begins to feel a new kind of peace. It is not the shallow peace of distraction or false contentment, but a deep, steady calm of one who has faced her own darkness and discovered it to be survivable, even meaningful. The woman who walks alone no longer needs to outsource her sense of safety or worth to another. She carries it within her. Built from the fragments of herself, she was brave enough to reclaim. In knowing her shadow, she begins to walk lighter, speak clearer, and love herself with a tenderness access that requires no permission. And in time, should she choose to walk alongside another, it will be not from a place of need, but of wholeness. The woman who walks alone without the immediate comfort of romantic attachment finds herself in a space where external validation holds far less influence. In relationships, it is easy, almost inevitable, to become entangled in the unspoken need to be approved of, desired, chosen, and confirmed through the eyes of another. Certainly the worth of one's being can become contingent on how one is perceived, on how affection is given or withheld, on whether one is meeting the expectations of a partner. Without realizing it, many women come to measure their desirability, value, and even their identity through the gaze of a boyfriend or lover. It is a persistent and ancient pattern woven into both personal experience and collective conditioning. But when she walks alone, a woman is no longer continuously reflected in another's gaze. She is no longer performing for approval, no longer adjusting her words, emotions, or appearance to secure affection or avoid conflict. This absence of an external audience creates a profound internal shift. At first, it may feel unsettling, even lonely. It is a subtle affirmation that once punctuated her days. A compliment, a text message, a hand reaching for hers, are gone, and with them the immediate reassurance of being wanted or seen. What remains is the necessity to locate worth, not in what she evokes in others, but in what she discovers within herself. This process requires unlearning old habits of seeking validation from external sources. It invites her to question where a sense of self-worth truly originates. Does it lie in her physical appearance, in the role she fulfills, in how others feel in her presence? Or can it be rooted in something deeper, more enduring? Her capacity to be with herself, to understand her own thoughts, to honor her own feelings without needing them to be mirrored or endorsed by someone else. The woman begins to realize that for much of her life, approval was a currency she learned to trade for safety, affection, or belonging. In solitude, the economy of validation shifts. There is no one else to barter with. The only relationship that remains is the one she has with herself. In this space, she starts to notice which parts of herself she truly values, separate from how they are received by others. She may realize that certain qualities she once highlighted in relationships, gentleness, beauty, agreeableness, were emphasized not because they were her most cherished traits, but because they were most likely to be affirmed by her partner. Conversely, parts of herself she may have concealed, ambition, restlessness, sharp wit, fierce independence, begin to surface in solitude, no longer filtered through the fear of rejection or disapproval. As she continues to walk alone, her attachment to praise and external reassurance diminishes. She learns that validation from others, though pleasurable, is fleeting and ultimately insufficient to sustain a meaningful sense of worth. The compliments that once lifted her spirits lose their power to define her. The absence of approval no longer feels like a condemnation. She begins to develop a sturdy, quieter confidence, one that is built not on being desired, but on being known, first by herself and eventually by those capable of seeing her as she is, rather than as they wish her to be. This kind of self-reliance is neither cold nor self-centered. It does not reject connection, but it changes the terms upon which connection is sought. The woman no longer enters relationships hungry for affirmation, but instead from a place of fullness, where another's regard is welcome, but not required for her to feel whole. She learns to enjoy the company of others without losing herself in their perceptions. She discovers the rare freedom of expressing her desires, thoughts, and boundaries without the hidden motive of securing approval. In this way, walking alone becomes a crucible in which a deeper, steadier sense of self is forged. one capable of standing firm in both solitude and companionship, rooted not in what is given by others, but in what has been uncovered, accepted, and loved within herself. A woman who walks alone without a boyfriend inevitably steps into a space where society's expectations and silent scripts become glaringly visible. For centuries, culture has woven narratives around what it means for a woman to be alone, often equating solitude with deficiency. From ancient folklore to modern media, the lone woman is viewed with suspicion, pity, or romanticized a tragedy. She is too proud, too difficult, too intimidating, too damaged, or simply unlucky. The absence of a romantic partner becomes a subject of speculation, as though her worth or completeness depends on being claimed by another. And so, walking alone is not merely a physical act, but a psychological and cultural rebellion against deeply embedded constructs. Without a partner, a woman begins to notice how often conversations, social gatherings, and cultural markers orbit around romantic attachments. She witnesses how women are praised for being desired, envied for being chosen, and pitied for being single. These unspoken rules begin early and are subtly reinforced through family traditions, peer expectations, and the way stories are told. Fairy tales end with marriage as a reward. Films glorify romantic union as life's ultimate achievement, and advice columns prescribe endless ways to become more lovable, more accommodating, more desirable. In choosing solitude, or even simply existing in it without despair, a woman directly challenges these cultural narratives. She becomes a quiet disruption to a system that prefers women preoccupied with being pleasing, attached, and defined through the lens of partnership. The more comfortable she becomes with her own company, the more unsettling she may appear to those still invested in traditional role. Freedom, not just physical, but emotional and psychological, becomes a threat to the status quo. People might question her choices, subtly remind her of her biological clock, or suggest that independence is admirable for now, as though it is merely a pause before returning to the expected script. But it is precisely in this resistance that a woman's identity begins to reshape itself. Free from the need to conform to what others expect of a woman her age, background, or appearance, she starts to author her own narrative. She may find herself drawn to pursuits she once set aside in the pursuit of being loved. She may realize that the qualities once deemed too much, her self-tendencies, curiosity, boldness, or emotional depth, are in fact the very traits that make her life rich and meaningful. In solitude, she discovers that fulfillment is not confined to romantic validation. She builds relationships with her own ideas, her creativity, her body, and her spirit. She cultivates friendships, deepens family bonds, explores passions, and begins to understand that her life is not a holding pattern until a partner arrives, as the time alone ceases to be an absence and becomes a presence in itself, a fertile, potent space where new parts of her identity can emerge. He also begins to perceive how certain societal expectations have internalized themselves within her, shaping her desires and self-worth in ways she did not fully realize. There may be moments of grief as she mourns the years spent chasing external approval or relationships that existed more for public affirmation than genuine connection. But this grief is cleansing. It makes room for a kind of self-respect not built on defiance, but on clarity. By choosing to walk alone, whether for a season or a lifetime, she teaches herself and others that a woman's value is intrinsic, not relational. It does not rise and fall with the presence of a boyfriend, a husband, or a title. She models a life where companionship is a choice, not a necessity, and where self-worth is sovereign. And though society may continue to whisper its old narratives, she no longer listens. Her task, while quieter and less applauded, is one of radical authenticity. It demands courage, yes, but it grants in return a depth of freedom and self-acknowledge that few are ever brave enough to claim. A woman who walks alone without a boyfriend gradually develops an inner wisdom that cannot be taught through words, only lived through experience. In the silence of her solitude, she begins to witness the quiet forces that shape the human psyche. The longings, fears, attachments, and illusions that drive so many of our decisions without our conscious consent, without the steady distraction of romantic involvement. She learns to sit with herself, to observe her emotions as they rise and fall, and to notice the subtle patterns that once dictated her need for approval or connection. This self-observation becomes a kind of inner alchemy where the raw material of her unexamined desires is gradually transformed into understanding. What many fear about solitude is not the absence of another, but the presence of oneself. The empty room, the quiet evenings, the unshared accomplishments, these moments confront a person with the truth of their own being. In relationships, it is easy to project, to deflect, to drown one's inner uncertainties in the comfort of another's attention. When a woman walks alone, however, there is no one else to carry the burden of her disquiet. She must face her restlessness, her envy, her unfulfilled hopes, and the tender parts of herself she once disguised to be loved. This is not a punishment, but an initiation into a deeper kind of knowledge. She comes to see that many of the things she once chased, validation, romance, admiration, were attempts to soothe an inner ache she had yet to name. The compliments, the dates, the flirtations, and the longing for someone to call her their own were not wrong in themselves, but they were often substitutes for a more essential kind of affirmation, the kind that can only be offered from within. Alone, she begins to see the difference between loneliness and solitude, between craving attention and cultivating presence, between being seen and truly being known. Over time, this clarity gives rise to discernment. She becomes more aware of the forces at work, not only within herself but in others. She can sense when attention is given out of need rather than genuine care, when affection is transactional, when conversation masks deeper insecurities. What she once might have mistaken for love, she now recognizes as dependency. What she once interpreted as redirection, she now sees as her solitude sharpens her intuition, for without the noise of constant interaction, the subtle language of emotion, energy, and intention becomes easier to hear. This wisdom also manifests as a kind of lightness. She no longer feels the need to control how she is perceived or to bend herself to fit another's preferences. The opinions of others, while noted, no longer define her reality. In walking alone, she has met her own depths and knows she can defer, even flourish, without the crutch of constant companionship. This confidence is not arrogant, but serene. It does not require proclamation. It simply is. In this state, if love arrives, it is welcome not as a necessity, but as a gift, something that adds to an already rich existence rather than completing it. And if it does not arrive, there is no panic, no sense of failure, no desperate search. The woman has come to trust the unfolding of her life, recognizing that certain seasons are meant for company and others for solitude, each carrying its own wisdom. She realizes that the deeper purpose of solitude is not isolation but integration. It is in the aloneness that one gathers the scattered pieces of identity, tends to old wounds, and discerns what is truly essential. The woman who walks alone discovers that her most important relationship is not with a man or even with the world, but with a quiet, mysterious self that watches from within, the part of her that was never lost, only waiting to be met. In knowing this, she carries herself differently. She walks not ahead or behind others, but firmly in step with herself, at peace with whatever path unfolds before her. And so the woman who walks alone, without a boyfriend, without the socially expected arm to lean upon, embodies a quiet yet radical defiance against the conditioned patterns of her time, not by rebellion in loud declarations, but by the simple profound act of choosing her own company and finding it enough. And through solitude, she uncovers the hidden landscapes of her mind, confronts the inherited narratives of worth tied to romantic attachment, and reclaims her identity from the projections of culture and expectation. Her walk is not one of loneliness, but of conscious self-possession, a pilgrimage into her own depths, where wisdom, resilience, and serenity reside. We are desperate to define women by their proximity to another. She becomes a living reminder that the most sacred relationship one can cultivate is with the self, not the egoic self shaped by applause or attention, but the eternal, watching self that exists beneath all roles and names. If love arrives, it will meet her as an equal, not a rescuer. If it does not, she remains whole. The woman who walks alone carries a power too ancient for words and too vast for surface understanding. She does not wait to be chosen, for she has already chosen herself. And in doing so, she becomes a mirror in which others might one day dare to recognize their own unseen strengths.